Therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate answered, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and chief priests delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Therefore Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" Pilate then took Jesus and had him scourged. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and put a purple robe on him. And they began to come up to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews," as they slapped him in the face. Pilate came out and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you." Jesus then came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." So when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The chief priests answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God." Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid, and he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me, unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Hearing this, Pilate made efforts to release him. But the priests cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar." Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was this day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour when Pilate said to the Jewish leaders, "Behold your king." So they cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." My brothers and sisters, the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Can you hear me? Yes. Beware of man with the microphone. You may be seated. I've been invited to give the homily here this morning. even though Father Toten made it sound like I insisted I was going to. I leave it to you to guess the real truth. It's a good thing I have my microphone so that I can be sure that Larry Mullen can hear me.
I hear you.
Oh, okay, that's good. Larry has been coming here to this church for over 25 years now, right, Larry?
I think more than that.
More than that. So he's listened to a lot of homilies I've given, so now I'm forcing him to have to listen to one more. But it's great to be back with my faith community here at St. Matthew Church. I've missed you these last several months. So it's good to be back with the beloved community of St. Matthew. You are truly the people of God and a household of faith. And so since my stroke in April, I've missed a lot of church. So don't let that give you an excuse. Anyway, I'm glad you're all here this morning, that we can gather around the table of Jesus and celebrate this Holy Eucharist and be reminded of the really important things in life by the gospel. You know, someone one time was really offended by another. Have you ever been offended by someone? Yeah, that's happened to you. Yeah, I meant to say that I claim it has happened to me. Far too often do I make that claim. And it's often said that the person who is offended oftentimes creates more trouble than the person who did the original offense. I think there's some truth in that statement, don't you?
Yes.
And the message for us this morning from Christ is that we might as well forgive them now, because ultimately you're going to have to. Isn't that a good saying? Forgive now. Get it dealt with, because ultimately you're going to have to forgive that person in order to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And today we celebrate the great feast, the solemn feast of Christ our King. And indeed, when you think about it, wouldn't you rather Christ be your King and your ruler than anyone else?
Yes.
And so that's what we're here to remind ourselves of, that Christ is the King. Liturgically speaking, this is the last Sunday of the year, and it's the culmination of a year of following Jesus through the mystery of his nativity and his passion and death and resurrection, and through a whole year of studying and hearing from the gospel his wonderful teaching. And so the question before us on this last liturgical Sunday of the year is this: who rules in your heart? That is the question that I must face myself. The question is, Peter, who rules in your heart? And that is a question not only for me, but also for all of you that are here today. So that is the real crux of the matter. Because Jesus teaches that within each human heart, there is a secret chamber. There is a secret place in your heart. And in that place, there is a throne. And who is on that throne of your heart? We have a lot of pretenders to the throne that demand our allegiance. But there's only one king who is suitable to reign within your heart. And that's the question that is before us today. When we think of kings, we think of civilization, do we not? Aren't we a strange creature, we Homo sapiens?
Yes.
We're a strange species, indeed. And for most of our history, we ran around in the wilderness. And but then a few thousand years ago, not very long ago, some of our ancestors got the idea to invent civilization. What do you think of civilization? It gives you the theater and movies and the iPhone, among other things. So we created civilization. And when I thought about the mystery of human civilization, I began to think about this, and it raised some curious questions. And I became convinced after deep thought on this matter, and you don't have to quote me on this, but I'm convinced that it was women who created civilization. They wanted things to be more organized and predictable. You know, we men would have been happy swinging in the trees forever. And someone came up with the idea, let's get civilized here. And so human history and the history of civilization only begins a few thousand years ago. I hope this is not dull to you. It sounds like a history class. But I'm going to give you a little bit of a history if you don't mind. So indulge me for a moment and be patient. And believe me, I know you've been praying this sermon would end at any moment. And your prayer will be answered, I can assure you. But anyway, the first human social unit that became something anywhere close to being what we would call civilization is the human household. And so in the ancient world, human society was divided up into various households because people realized it was easier to cooperate with one another, to survive and make a living than it was to do a solo kind of enterprise. And so households were founded, and there was a head of a household. And sometimes in the ancient world, the head of the household is either a man or a woman. It was whoever was the smartest at the moment. And so these households were formed across the ancient world, and they became the building blocks of civilization. After a while, in a given region or locality, these households would get together and they would build a city. Can you imagine that? And so the ancient world was divided up originally into different, what modern scholars call city-states. And each city-state had a ruler, kind of like the head of the household, but on steroids. And they called that ruler of a city a king. So every city had its own king. And modern scholars refer to this as city-states. Each city was its own state and had its own king. But there was one city-state on the Italian peninsula. Leave it to the Italians to figure out a new way to expand this idea. And this was a city-state called Rome. And Rome decided that it would conquer all the other city-states and form these city-states that ranged across the whole Mediterranean region, the known world, into one giant empire. And people welcomed this idea because it was good for business. You know, the Romans brought order and peace. They called it the Pax Romana. They built roads and aqueducts. So Rome was good for the economy, and having the empire was good for the economy. So people supported it. They liked the idea. And the Romans were small little guys. I want you to know that. Don't think of them as being terribly big. They had a lot of big enemies, and they had to subdue. So the only thing they could do was to outsmart them by being better organized. And that's what they did. They built an army that was unbeatable in the field. And they built a great infrastructure. They built the roads and the aqueducts. Now this is stuff I know you already know, and you already passed your history class, so I'm not going to bore you with any more details about that. But the Romans forged out of all these city-states an empire. Now, I told you before that the city-states were made by, were assembled by, made up of households. You know, in Greek, the word for household is oikos. It's where we get the word ecumenical. Did you know that?
No.
Sometimes it's interesting to study the origin of words. It explains a lot that we don't understand, but we pretend we understand. So anyway, oikos meant household, and it's where we get the word ecumenical from. And so when we say that we're St. Matthew's Ecumenical Catholic Church, part of what we're saying is that we're a household. We're a household of faith. That's what we're about. But we have to ask, who is the head of our household? And each of us in our own hearts in a secret chamber has to ask, who rules in my heart? And the Feast of Christ the King, which we celebrate today, reminds us of who it is that ought to be reigning within our hearts. And that is Christ. He's the only one who's worthy. He's the only one who makes the grade, so to speak. He's the only one that can make us great again. My brothers and sisters, I hope I'm not misunderstood by these statements to you. But we might as well acknowledge that Christ should be our King. And you might want to rule your own life through your ego, and your ego is an illusion. It is an artificial construct that we have invented so we have a sense of who we are. But it's not real. But Christ is real. And he's the only one that is deserving of our allegiance. He's the only one that we should submit our lives to. And one of the things that Christ tells us to do as our King, he says, you know that person who has offended you? You know who that person is. You call to mind that person who has recently offended you. You know what Christ says to do about that? Go ahead and forgive that person. You're going to have to anyway someday. So you might as well do it now. That's wisdom. You know, we're called to forgive one another. We're called to live in community with one another. And so the Romans built this great empire, and it's called the Roman Empire. And you know, it lasted 1,000 years. That's quite an achievement. We have to acknowledge the greatness of Rome and being able to achieve that. And these little people called Latins or Italians who are able to achieve that. Now, it is something to really marvel at. But the fact of the matter is that there is another kingdom. And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. And when Jesus stood before Pontius Pilate, he stood before the emperor of Rome in the agency of this Roman governor. And Jesus said to him, my kingdom is not of this world. So Pilate asked him, so indeed you are a king. But Jesus emphasized in his interview with Pilate that his kingship was to be understood in a very different way than that of Caesar, the emperor. You know, the emperor of Rome was called the King of Kings because he captured and conquered all these city-states with their many kings, and he became the ruler of all of them. And then there comes this upstart carpenter from Nazareth, and people are starting to call him the King of Kings. But they mean something very different than the Roman emperor meant. Something very different indeed. And this is what we're confronted with today. Who rules in your heart? You might as well surrender now, because eventually you'll have to. And it's written by the Apostle Paul in one of his letters that every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So it will happen. And Jesus reveals to us certain things about the kingdom. And it's in the New Testament. Can you believe it? We can go and consult a book, and we can find out some information that is very useful to us. The New Testament is part of the Bible. Did you know that? The New Testament was written in the Greek language. And one thing about the Greek language is that it has its own alphabet. It has different letters. So when you see the Greek language in its written form, you'll say to yourself, it looks like Greek to me. Who can read this stuff? Anyway, there is a letter in the Greek alphabet. It's called a kappa. It's kind of equivalent to the English or the Latin K. And it's a hard sound. And there are three words that start with the letter kappa in the Greek language that I want to call your attention to on this feast day of Christ the King. The first one is the word charisma. And you ask me, can you want to say that with me? Say the word charisma. Congratulations, you're speaking Greek. Charisma. Charisma simply refers to the story. It's the big story. It's the story of Jesus. It's the story of the king. Kerygma is the story of Jesus. And you open up the New Testament, pages of the New Testament, and you turn into that portion are called the Gospels. It'll tell you that story. And it begins with an angel that visits a young Jewish maiden girl. And she becomes pregnant. And you know the story, right?
Yeah.
I got to tell you something. When I was a young man, I had a daughter. I still have a daughter, but she's an adult now. But I had a little girl, and she was in 3rd grade. And she came up to me with a quizzical look on her face. And she says, "Daddy, what is all this about Jesus being raised from the dead?" And I said, "Well, Sarah, it went like this." And I began the story, and I told her the whole thing. I said it began with a little girl in Nazareth who became pregnant and gave birth to a child. And I went through the whole story of Jesus. And then I said, and then he was crucified and rejected by the people. They did not recognize him as being their king. And so they rejected him. And he suffered and he died. And they buried him in a tomb. But 3 days later, he rose from the dead. I said it with great dramatic emphasis to her. And her eyes were big and round. And she looks at me, and then she gets a skeptical look on her face. And she says, "Oh, no, that didn't happen. You can't believe that." And I said, "Well, that's the story. That's the story. That's the kerygma. That's the story." And the story, or the kerygma, is the foundation of our very existence as a people of faith. And then there's another Greek word that starts with a kappa. And I'm not referring to a fraternity or sorority when I say that. And that word, that second word starts with the word kappa, is kenosis. You want to say it with me? Kenosis. Kenosis is a verb. It means to empty, to be emptied out. And so what we have first is the word kerygma, which is the story of the king. And kenosis is the emptying of the king. Because the king comes into the world and he empties himself. He suffers like any other human being. Maybe in the case of most of us, he suffers more than most of us. It's called the passion. St. Paul refers to this when he says he did not regard his equality with God as something to be exploited to dominate others, but rather he embraced a way of suffering and surrender. And we're called to do the same. That's the word kenosis. And every great spiritual tradition, be it Buddhist or Christian or whatever it is, has some notion or idea of surrendering the ego, of giving up the false self. Because all spiritual people know if you don't, you'll be self-deceived. How many know that to be true? Yeah, you don't want to be self-deceived. So it's time to surrender. And just like you might as well forgive that person who's offended you now, because eventually you have to. Well, you might as well surrender to Jesus as your king now, because ultimately you're going to have to anyway. So you might as well just do it. So that is the message of Christ the King. And then Jesus surrendered himself up to his Father's will. And so he suffered and he died. But God vindicated him and glorified him. And that's the meaning of the resurrection in part. Although the resurrection has more to say to us than just that. And then finally, there's a third and final Greek word that starts with the letter kappa. And it's called koinonia. And koinonia is a Greek word that is translated by an Old English word. You've heard it before. It's called fellowship. Have you heard of fellowship? So what the third word is referring to, the first word is, it's the story of the king. It's the greatest story ever told. I think there was a movie named that. The story of the king. The second word is kenosis, the emptying of the king, his suffering, his journey on our behalf. And then finally, there is this one, which is the fellowship of the king. And the fellowship of the king is the Holy Communion. Now, I'm not thinking of the Eucharist, although that is part of it, because the Eucharist is the means by which we enter into communion. But communion means to have a shared common life together. So we are a communion, a community. We share a common life together. And that is what is meant by the word fellowship or communion. We share a common life. We indeed do. And if Jesus is our king, then we belong to the same kingdom. And if we belong to the same kingdom, then we are in communion with one another. And we have the same destiny and destination. Does this make sense?
Yes.
Someone out there say amen.
Amen.
Oh, I'm glad you're paying attention. So, does this make any kind of sense to you?
Yes.
Okay, so the Romans created an empire that would last 1,000 years. They did it by force of arms and by building a great infrastructure. They were good at building roads and walls and aqueducts and things like that. And they were good for business. So people were okay with the Romans because of the benefits of having an empire outweighed the detriment to it. So you have to pay a little taxes. That's okay, because what we get in return is so much greater. And so that is the Roman system. That's the Roman Empire. But Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. And even though he was put on trial by the kingdom of this world, his kingdom was not of this world. His kingdom is a spiritual kingdom. And Jesus reigns not on a throne of stone or precious metal in some city far away, but he reigns right within your heart if you let him. And you might as well let him reign now, because ultimately you'll have to, and you will, and you'll be glad that you did. And this is the meaning of the feast day that we're celebrating today, Christ the King. He is there's a poem I want to read to you. Now I know as soon as I said I have a poem I want to read to you, your mind's turned off. There's nothing more boring than someone reading a poem. But let me tell you, this particular poem that I'm going to read to you is actually the lyrics of a hymn that is sung by the church throughout the ages. It says, crown him with many crowns. And it says, crown him, you know who him is, Jesus of Nazareth. Crown him with many crowns, the Lamb upon his throne. All kingdoms of the earth resound in praise of him alone. Awake my soul and sing of him who died for thee, and hail him as thy matchless King for all eternity. Crown him the Lord of life, who triumphed over the grave, who on the third day did arise, and hope to sinners gave. His glory now we sing, who died and rose on high, who came eternal life to bring, who lives no more to die. Then finally, crown him the Lord of heaven, where angels sing above. Crown him the King, to whom is given the wondrous name of love. Crown him with many crowns, as thrones before him fall. Throughout the earth his praise resounds, for he is Lord of all. And believe me, the Romans built a great empire that lasted 1,000 years. Do you know that in the 4th century, a Roman emperor would bow the knee to Christ the King? Did you know that? And thus was born Christendom. But that's significant because even though Jesus was put under trial and crucified under the authority of the Emperor of Rome, eventually the Emperor of Rome had to give in and acknowledge that Christ is King. Now, if the Emperor of Rome could do that, then certainly little old me living in the 20th century could do the same. I can easily surrender my heart and soul to the one who commands and demands my allegiance, and it is Christ the King, and he certainly deserves it because he reigns through the power of love. And if I acknowledge Christ as my Lord and King, make him the ultimate standard by which I make every decision in life, you can be sure that you'll make better decisions and that I will be a better person because of it. You will be a better person if Christ reigns in your heart. And then people are going to want to know the secret of your life, and you'll be able to share with them. It is because I honor my King who reigns within my heart in that secret chamber. No one knows where that is, but Jesus knows where it is. And he's knocking. He's speaking to you now. He's knocking, and he says to you, behold, I stand at the door and knock. And if anyone hears my voice and opens the door and lets me in, then I will have dinner with you. He says literally in the Greek, but what he really means is I will have koinonia with you. I will have communion with you, and you'll be in communion with me. and we'll share a common life. And that's the way it must be if we are to find fulfillment and happiness and joy in this life and the life that is yet to come. So the question before us today, my brothers and sisters, is who is the king in your life? Who reigns in your heart and soul? It makes all the difference in the world. And that's what we're called to think about on this feast day as we celebrate the feast of He who is our rightful King, Christ the King, He who was anointed to be our King. When He was baptized and the voice from heaven came, "You are my beloved Son," that is the words of kingship. Jesus knew who He was. We need to know who we are, but we also need to know who He is. Because our story only makes sense insofar that it's connected to His story. Our lives only make sense insofar it's connected to His life and that He rules within our hearts. And then, once Christ rules within your heart, then the revolution begins. And it's a whole new world order that comes upon you and everyone around you. Because you'll be changed, you'll be different. You'll love like never before because He's the Lord of love. You'll be wiser and smarter than you ever were before because He's the Lord of all wisdom and truth. In fact, He's the embodiment of truth. And so the question before us today, before you leave this church, the question before you today is, who's going to be the King and Lord of your life? And what difference does it make? And I submit to you this morning, that makes all the difference in the world. And I urge you to consider this possibility for your own life. It will transform you, and it will transform everyone around you. It will be a bright light that will shine that the darkness will not be able to overcome. And that, my brothers and sisters, is the gospel of the Lord.
Amen.